There is one thing that we all have in common, that at some point, we all die. Now, if you're like me, which if you're here listening, you probably are, you enjoy being a little scared now and then. But death has a way of bringing a new type of fear to light. Not always for the reasons you might think, though. No, we tend to not fear death itself as much as we fear what comes after. It's probably why we've spent so much of our life planning for what remains of us after death. And if history has taught us anything, it's that for thousands of years, humans have come up with some beautiful and very chilling ways to say goodbye. Welcome back, spooky souls, to another episode of Let's Talk Spooky. I'm your host, Shauna, and tonight we follow the trail of mourning veils, whispering prayers, and graves marked with more than just names. And if you've stumbled upon our little community of spookies, welcome. This podcast explores the eerie space where folklore, urban legend, and haunted history come together. If that's something you like to hear more of, click the follow button wherever you listen to your podcast and leave a comment. I'd love to hear from you. For centuries, people have buried their dead with care, with caution, not just out of love or grief, but out of fear as well. Fear that something that may not be the loved one might return. So from coffins nailed shut to iron spikes into the bodies of buried face down to keep spirits from rising, funeral rites have a way of walking the line between respect and superstition. Tonight, we'll journey through burial rites of the past, the eerie, the sacred, and in honesty, the downright chilling. This week's episode is a two-parter. So tonight we'll be focusing on the rituals of funeral traditions across history, and then join me next Friday, where we get a little bit more spooky and focus on the superstitions of keeping the buried, well, just that, buried. While keeping the buried, well, buried. So grab your black veil, your gold coin, and maybe a little salt for good measure. And let's talk spooky. The funeral was small. A few local townsfolk, dressed in black, walked down the fog-covered dirt road, coffin in hand, to say goodbye to a local man they had knew well. The villagers followed the procession, speaking in hushed tones, for there was something troubling them. This man was burdened with sin, and they knew it. Now, for the context of this story, it's not really known what sin he carried, but I'll let you use your imagination that his home life wasn't necessarily a peaceful one. Nonetheless, mourners knew all too well that when someone died with sin, especially sin unconfessed, the worse. No. Nonetheless, the mourners knew that when someone dies with sins unconfessed, or worse, too poor to make peace with the church, something is summoned. The sin eater. He, or in very rare cases she, was shuffled in after the coffin had been closed. A humble plate of bread and a sip of ale was placed directly above the corpse's chest. The sin eater ate the bread, drank the ale, and muttered an eerie incantation. I give easement and rest now to thee. For thy peace I pawn my soul. And just like that, The deceased sins were passed into the eater's body, and the spirit was freed to pass on unburdened by the past. Found mostly in Wales and some rural parts of England between the 17th and 16th century, the role of a sin eater was a strange, deeply spiritual, and widely feared one. The practice likely arose of a mixture of Christian beliefs about the soul and salvation, and older folk traditions and Celtic lore about spiritual transfer and purification. The need for sin eaters came from the very real problem of rural communities. People who died suddenly, violently, or in isolation often had no priest to perform last rites. Without these rites, their souls were believed to be at risk, either trapped in purgatory or returning as a restless spirit. But even though the sin eaters provided a spiritual service, they were deeply stigmatized. They were often social outcasts, treated with superstition, and subject to even disgust from their local communities. People feared them, not just because of the sins they carried, but because of the way they had been spiritually polluted. They were rarely thanked, often feared, and always alone. The church opposed the practice of sin eating, calling it heretical and unholy. But in isolated villages, sin eaters remained a part of folk tradition well into the early 20th century. The most famous known sin eater was Richard Maslow of The most famous known sin eater was Richard Maslow of Shropshire, England, who died in 1906. He was considered the last known practitioner of this rite, and interestingly, unlike most sin eaters, Maslow was a well-respected man, a farmer with good means, and some say he had taken up the role after the loss of several of his own children, hoping in some way to help others find peace where he could not. His grave was recently restored in 2010 with a rare recognition of his role so that he would not be forgotten for the role that he. His grave was restored in 2010 with a rare recognition of his role in life. Sin eating may have ended over a century ago, but the idea behind it still lingers. That guilt, impurity, and spiritual burden can be passed from one person to another, and that even after death, someone might be needed to take the weight of the past away. The role of a sin eater was solitary, feared, and over time forgotten. They would consume the final meal laid upon the dead, and with every bite they carried the darkness of another's soul with them, offering a redemption when no priest could be found. A quiet, unsettling ritual meant to ease the dead into whatever came next. But in the far reaches of the 5th and 4th century BCE, that particular journey wasn't just left to chance. In ancient Greece, the soul didn't rise or drift, it traveled across a dark river that separated the world of the living from the land of the dead. And to do so, you needed more than just a ritual to help you get there. You needed a coin. You see, death wasn't considered the end, but much like ancient Egyptians, it was seen as the beginning of a new journey. But in order to take the next step, you needed to pay your dues. Once the individual died, their soul was passed into the realm of between worlds. Some could say it's a nod to the term we might be more familiar with today as purgatory. But regardless of its name, once your soul entered, you would have to gain access to the river Stye. You would have to gain access to the river Stye, who was named by Charon. But regardless of its name, once your soul entered, you would have to gain access to the river Stye, who was minded by Charon, who could. Oh man. But regardless of its name, once your soul entered, you would have to gain access to the river Stye by means of a chariot. Charon, who was looked upon like your modern day Uber driver of the dead, helped those cross from one realm to the next. But not if you didn't have payment first. Those who passed into the underworld were to bring a coin, known as an obol. Using the coin placed upon their mouth, using the coin placed in their mouth, or even sometimes on their eyes, they would be granted access to the next world as they crossed the river. But without it, a soul was believed to be trapped. The trapped soul would wander shores of the underworld for hundreds or thousands of years, lost, restless, and possibly vengeful. This tradition became so ingrained in Greek funeralism practices that it showed up again and again in archaeological records. Graves from as far back as the 5th century have been found with coins placed in mouths near skulls of the deceased. Some were made of real silver or bronze, but others, for those whose money was more scarce, were clay imitations, a hopeful offering meant to deceive the gods, or at least satisfy ritual. The coin wasn't just payment, though. It was a spiritual safeguard, a small token to ensure the dead weren't forgotten or left behind. This tradition of funeral coinage reflects something deeper, a fear of souls becoming trapped between worlds, in a place where they might be able to return. And this fear wasn't just limited to Greece. Many cultures shared the beliefs that death required a passage of sorts, either through coin, ritual, or purification. We see similar rituals across cultures and time, from Viking ship burials often including weapons, goods, or coins, to Egyptian tombs stocked with food, money, and ritual items for the journey through to the other world, for the journey through to the next. And even in modern Haiti, coins are still sometimes buried with the dead to appease Barban Samedi Loy of the grave. To appease Baron Samedi Loa of the grave. But what all of these cultures had in mind was a very real purpose to appease the gods. But what each of these cultures had in common was a real need to appease the gods, not just to neglect or worry of the neglecting of a burial, but they worried it left a door open for something much scarier to return. So we've traveled to Greece, So we've traveled from the Greek underworld to the sin eaters of Britain. But what about today? You might think of our modern funerals as neat, clinical, and entirely rational. But beneath the surface, many people still follow rituals and folklore-rooted ceremonies that spawn from fear of... Ugh. You might think of our modern funerals as neat, clinical, and rational. But beneath the surface, many people still follow the rituals that folklore are rooted in centuries of fear, protection, and reverence of the dead. One of the most commonly used funeral traditions in many Western and European cultures are the use of a wake. Still commonly used today, wakes give loved ones the opportunity to see the individual one last time before their next step in the burial process. However, before the use of mortuaries and embalming practices, most deaths happened at home. They were very slow, personal, and far more unsettling of a process. Wakes were born of fear of premature burial, souls returning, or something worse, the dead not quite staying dead. In 1839, a 17-year-old Susan Armstrong fell suddenly ill with what doctors believed to be the sweating sickness, which today is known as hantavirus. After the symptoms began, Susan's family watched as she grew pale, cold, and still. The days after the fall of her decline, days after her decline, she was officially declared dead and quickly interned in the family crypt beneath the church. It was winter after all. The stone vault was cold, the funeral was brief, and before long, Susan was alone down there. Roughly a week later, the sexton noticed that the iron gate of the Armstrong vault was ajar. It was odd, since he knew he had locked it after the funeral. Curious and uneasy, he descended the stone steps to check. There, inside the tomb, he found Susan's coffin, open. The lid had been pushed off from the inside, and her burial shroud was torn. Her hands were bloodied and broken, and locked in their final terrible grasp at the side of the casket. She had been buried alive. They say the expression on her face couldn't be described, that her mouth was open, that it looked as though she had been caught in mid-scream, and her eyes staring upward had turned completely white. And her eyes, staring upward, had turned completely white. The family had rushed to the burial. I'm going to start over that. They say the expression on her face couldn't be described. Her mouth was open, as if caught in mid-scream. Her eyes, staring upward, had turned completely white. And the family, who had rushed to bury her to prevent the spread of a disease they feared, not only slowed the process, and the family that had rushed to bury her to prevent the spreading of an illness they feared ended up killing her instead. Stories like Susan's weren't uncommon in the 18th and 19th century. Before modern medicine, comas, fevers could mimic death so perfectly that many had been buried alive purely by mistake. So the ritual of a wake was adopted in order to give loved ones a chance to wake up, in case for those who may or may not have actually been dead, they would inevitably what is the word? Stories like Susan's weren't uncommon in the 18th and 19th century. Before modern medicine, comas, fevers, and other diseases could almost mimic death perfectly. And in rural communities, fear of a disease spreading often led to hasty interment and sometimes even horrifying results. I wanted to share one last creepy story with you guys. This one is a modern story about somebody who got a little bit more than they bargained for when they were preparing someone for death, when they were preparing someone for their funeral. The story was shared on Reddit by user u-missy may pen. Before we end, okay. This story was shared by Reddit user u-missy may pen. When my cousin was 18, he was in a bad car wreck. He and his girlfriend and his sister were all pronounced dead at the scene. The police arrived and informed my aunt, his mom, and she asked that he be sent to a specific funeral home for preparations. While they were preparing to embalm him, he raised up and asked, "Oh my God, are you serious?" Before we end part 1 of this episode, I went down the creepy story rabbit hole and found this gem for you all. But I warn you, it might keep you up at night, because it certainly kept me up. This story was shared by Reddit user u-missy may pen. When my cousin was 18, he was in a bad wreck. He, his girlfriend, and his sister were all pronounced dead at the scene. The police arrived to inform my aunt, his mom, and she asked that he be sent to a specific funeral home. While they were preparing to embalm him, he raised up and asked, "Where the hell am I?" The funeral director said it was the first time he'd ever had to go home to change his pants. I should add that the top of his head was open and his brain was exposed. He was sent to the hospital, the same place the officers came to my aunt and pronounced him dead, and was told that he was not dead after all, but potentially in a vegetative state. A few weeks later, he walked out of the hospital. He experienced horrible headaches on occasion, but has led a successful life since, and he's a great guy. Stories like this remind us that the space between life and death has never been as certain as we'd like to believe it to be. If I'm being honest, I don't think I could return to work after that. As wonderful as a miracle it is, I'd be done. So now that we've peeled back the veil of funeral customs, rituals that have not only been shaped by grief, but by fear, from coins that have covered the cost of the afterlife, and wondering and waiting to see if those we truly love. From coins to cover the cost of the afterlife, to waiting to make sure those we love are truly gone, we start to understand why these traditions have lasted for so many generations. Because for much of history, death wasn't a clean ending. It was a doorway to something more. And no one could say for what, but all we know is that we did not want to come back through it. Because for much of history, death wasn't a clean ending. It was more like a doorway. No one could say for sure what might come back through, if not shut completely. And next week, we're not simply guiding the spirits to the light, we're holding them down. Join me for part 2 as we dig into the darker side of burial lore, rituals that bind, trap, Join me for part 2 as we dig into the darker side of burial lore, from rituals meant to bind, trap, graves that have cages, stake burials, cursed coffins, and the chilling lengths people went to just to make sure the dead stayed dead. So until next episode, keep your mirrors covered and maybe check the salt line one more time. And as always, stay safe, stay curious, and stay spooky. This episode was written and produced by me, Shauna. If you have your own eerie tale or a hometown haunting or an episode suggestion, please email us at letstalkspookypodcast@gmail.com or follow us at Let's Talk Spooky Podcast on Instagram and TikTok. Until next time, stay spooky.